Okay, in the section today, we are going to treat the sine and the cosine, this time as functions. So we're going to create a relationship where y is equal to the sine of x. So this is a mapping that maps from the real numbers to itself. The domain here is all the real numbers. The codomain is all the real numbers. The range here, though, is -1 to 1. Okay? So the range of this function goes from -1 to 1. When you graph this, some interesting things happen. So let's imagine our graph here. And we're going to graph this across some particular values. We're going to graph it on the value of pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And then I'm going to graph it backwards too, to negative pi over 2, to negative pi, to negative 3 pi over 2, and to negative 2 pi. 2 pi. So if we graph these values, just these are like the major points on a circle. Right, we're going to go from 1 up here and -1 down here. So sine of 0 is 0. Sine of pi over 2 is 1. Sine of pi is 0. Sine of 3 pi over 2 is -1. Sine of 2 pi is again 0. Now, later in class, we're going to look at some of the intermediate values here. So like the pi over 3, the pi over 4, the 3, and things like that, and plot them. And when you do, you're going to find that this thing makes a wave. It kind of goes up and down and back. Now, if I go around, and this thing keeps going, this wave keeps repeating, because this from 0 to 2 pi is once around the circle. So this is just going to do that same wave again if I keep going forward. Now if I go backward, right, so this is going to take me back to -1 to 0. You can follow this on your unit circle, to 1 and then to 2 pi. So the wave goes this way, coming backwards. So this is going to be what we call the sine wave, and it's going to repeat this every 2 pi units, or as you know, like from degree land, every 60 degrees. Okay, so the key here with the sine is it bounces from 0 to 1 to 0 to -1 it changes like from 0 to 1 and then 1 back to 0 every pi over 2 units. It repeats the entire cycle every 2 pi. The key with the sine, though, is it starts at the origin. Okay, so we're going to look at all of this again, but then we're going to look at it with the cosine. Okay, so let's take a look at y is equal to the cosine of x. Right, so again, this is a mapping from the reals to the reals, but the range here is also still -1 is less than y is less than 1. Okay, so we just want to be aware of that. All right, so let's see what happens with the graph here. Again, I'm going to start at 0. I'm going to make a mark at pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, and I'm going to go backwards. Negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, negative 2 pi. So let's graph these. Now the cosine at 0, if you look at your unit circle, is at 1. So I'm going to have 1 up here and -1 here. So this does not start at the origin. It starts at the point 0, 1. And then it comes down to pi over 2, down to 0 at pi over 2, down to -1 at pi, back to 0 at 3 pi over 2, and then back to 1 at 2 pi. So we get that same wave, but it's off by like, kind of like half a wave, right? So this is going to keep going. It's going to make that wave, but it's off by a little bit. If I go backwards, it's going to come this way. Okay, so same wave going backwards, but it comes up this way. So note, the cosine wave doesn't start at the origin. It starts at 0, 1. And then it goes down. And whether you go left or right, it still goes down. So this thing is symmetric about the y-axis. The sine is not. The cosine, though, however, is. We'll get into later in other subjects where you are going to call the sine an odd function, you're going to call the cosine an even function, because one is symmetric about the origin and the other one has a weird kind of symmetry about the origin. Sorry, symmetric about the y-axis. Another one has a weird symmetry about the y-axis there. But these are the shape of these functions when you take them as functions instead of ratios. And we're going to play around with this a little bit in the next class. And then we're going to kind of look at their parameters. We're going to stretch them out. We're going to make them longer. But right now, the basic function has a repeating period of every 2 pi units for both the sine and the cosine. It has an amplitude of 1, which means it goes up 1 and down 1 from its center line. And they're actually the same curve. They're just shifted by pi over 2 units. So if you look at the cosine, it's actually the sine function shifted to the, the sine function shifted to the left pi over 2 units. So, or you could look at the sine is the cosine function shifted to the right pi over 2 units. All right, so this is an intro to sine and cosine as functions.